In just 47 seconds, a billionaire to publicly humiliate an African president on live television. He thought no one would dare respond, but what followed left over 300 world leaders in total silence. A 37-year-old soldier turned president stood up, face to face with the world's top billionaire. Not with anger, but with a truth so powerful, it shook the room. Why did Bezos target him? What did this young president say that made even Western diplomats shift in their seats? And most of all, was this the moment Africa finally said enough? Or just the beginning of a storm no one saw coming? To better understand this story, we have to go back to where it all began. It began not with a declaration of war, nor a clash of nations, but with a smirk. The room was gilded in ambition, a polished summit hall in Geneva filled with CEOs, diplomats, media moguls, and billionaires who had long grown accustomed to shaping the world through deals whispered behind closed doors. Cameras flashed, coffee cups clinked, and on center stage sat a man who needed no introduction. Jeff Bezos. The name alone was enough to tilt the direction of currencies and headlines. He leaned forward in his chair, casually adjusting his jacket, eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who had conquered the internet, retail, and outer space. He was asked about Africa, more specifically about his company's reluctance to invest heavily in certain regions. With a half laugh, he replied, "Well, it's hard to build distribution in places that still can't keep the Wi-Fi stable for more than 5 minutes. I mean, no offense to Burkina Faso, but even my Kindle gave up trying." He smiled as if the comment was harmless, just a quip, a harmless dig wrapped in humor. But the room responded exactly as he expected. A low wave of laughter rolled through the audience like a perfectly timed cue. A few business executives chuckled behind their hands. Some diplomats from Europe leaned back in their chairs with faint grins. A CNN journalist whispered into her colleague's ear, "He said what everyone's thinking." On the broadcast feed, the camera lingered on Bezos for a moment too long. Long enough to register the raised eyebrow, the satisfied smirk, the subtle shrug that said, "Next question." What he didn't notice, or perhaps didn't care to see, was the ripple it sent far beyond that stage. Thousands of miles away, in a modest government building in Ouagadougou, the screen froze for half a second before catching up. The connection lagged, just as Bezos had mocked. Bitter irony. But the room watching in Burkina Faso was dead silent. No chuckles, no shrugged shoulders, just stillness. President Ibrahim Traoré sat at the center, surrounded by a small team of aides, ministers, and 2 young soldiers from his communications unit. The lights buzzed faintly. The image of Bezos flickered on the monitor, frozen mid-smile. Traoré didn't move. He simply stared for a few seconds. Then he leaned back, folded his arms, and spoke in a voice soft enough that some in the room leaned in to catch it. "So that's how he sees us." No anger, no raised voice, but the weight of those 7 words landed like thunder. It wasn't the first time an African leader had been mocked, underestimated, or caricatured on the world stage, but this time, it was personal. This time, the insult wasn't just about poor infrastructure. It was about the assumption that dignity couldn't exist in a place without fiber optic cables. To understand the depth of what had just happened, one has to understand the man who was watching. Ibrahim Traoré was no career politician. At 37, he had once been just another name on a military roster. A captain known more for his stubborn discipline and love for history books than any political ambition. But Burkina Faso was tired. Tired of puppets, of interference, of promises that came with strings pulled from Paris or Washington. And in that exhaustion, the country had lifted a soldier into power, not because he had polished credentials, but because he had something rare, defiance laced with vision. Traoré had become the face of a movement sweeping through West Africa. A generation of leaders rejecting the script of dependency, refusing to smile politely while their nations were auctioned off piece by piece. So when Bezos laughed, he wasn't just laughing at Burkina Faso's Wi-Fi, he was laughing at that movement, at sovereignty, at rebellion, at the very idea that someone like Traoré could ever challenge someone like him. And yet, as the feed continued and the summit carried on with its next speaker, Traoré said nothing more. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't issue a statement. He just sat there, watching in silence, already calculating. In Geneva, the room had laughed. In Ouagadougou, something else had been set in motion. Something quiet, unannounced, but undeniable. Something that would turn those 47 seconds into a global reckoning. Jeff Bezos didn't just build a company. He built an empire above the clouds, both literally and metaphorically. With Blue Origin rockets piercing the sky and Amazon satellites circling the planet, Bezos became the living embodiment of a man who had risen so high he could look down on the world, and often did. His net worth danced between $150 and $200 billion, depending on the hour. He owned stakes in everything from global logistics to cloud computing, entertainment, AI infrastructure, and private space travel. There were data centers in Singapore, fulfillment hubs in Brazil, and facial recognition programs quietly deployed across the metropolitan police departments. By the time his company reached its peak influence, Amazon directly or indirectly touched over 120 countries, sometimes through products, sometimes through data, and sometimes through quiet political handshakes inked in boardrooms the public never saw. In Wall Street circles, they didn't just call him a tech magnate, they called him the airspace. Not because he flew, but because no one could move without going through him. To someone like Bezos, a nation like Burkina Faso barely registered. It wasn't a growth market, not a priority zone, not a red dot on a strategic roadmap. At best, it was a statistic. At worst, it was an afterthought. Great for minerals, bad for margins, he once said in a leaked email exchange with a regional strategist. The message was never meant for the public, but the words had a sting that clung like dust. To Bezos, African nations that weren't Nigeria, South Africa, or Egypt were places to extract from, not build with. The satellites didn't beam broadband there. The infrastructure wasn't rolled out, but the algorithms still tracked buying behavior. The warehouses still recruited. The shipping lines still flowed in one direction. It was as if the entire region existed only to make the rest of the world richer, just not rich enough to bother with respect. For years, Bezos had made comments that walked the line between provocative and cold-blooded. He was a master of satire at someone else's expense. Fix your roads before your rights. That one landed at a 2018 conference when asked about Amazon's refusal to support local unions in countries with poor infrastructure. Another time, at a tech summit in Silicon Valley, he quipped, "Why would I build servers in a place where even the streetlights flicker?" The crowd roared with laughter. A TED-style speaker followed up with, "Maybe they need solar servers." More laughter. These lines were received as wit, tech CEO bravado, jokes told by a man rich enough to say what others filtered. But what many missed, or chose not to confront, was that every one of those laughs came at the cost of dignity, at the cost of entire populations being reduced to punchlines. And over time, those punchlines stopped feeling clever and started sounding sinister. Then came the leaks. Documents smuggled from Amazon's West Africa division, authenticated by whistleblowers, began surfacing across independent African media platforms. The memos revealed a quiet but deliberate strategy to suppress wage increases in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger by lobbying local ministers through third-party consultants. In internal chats, executives discussed minimizing healthcare provisions to rural workers because they wouldn't know how to use the benefits anyway. Another note casually referenced the use of drone surveillance in mining-adjacent villages to prevent organized theft, though no such crimes had been reported. What looked like business efficiency on paper began to reek of something else: exploitation sanitized by spreadsheets. Publicly, Amazon remained clean, efficient, and obsessed with customer satisfaction. But beneath the polish, another story had started to emerge. One that painted Jeff Bezos not just as a billionaire above the clouds, but as a man who had forgotten how to see people on the ground. A man who believed efficiency excused empathy, and perhaps most dangerously, a man so convinced of his altitude, he never looked down long enough to realize who was rising up beneath him. Long before he stood behind presidential podiums or delivered speeches that rattled global institutions, Ibrahim Traoré was a quiet man in a noisy world. In 2019, he was still a captain, a name rarely mentioned beyond the confines of Burkina Faso's military ranks. On dusty training grounds, he was known for two things: unmatched discipline and an almost obsessive love for books. Most officers kept tactical manuals on their bunks. Traoré kept volumes of Frantz Fanon and Thomas Sankara, pages marked with pencil strokes and folded corners. His soldiers would sometimes find him late at night, seated on a wooden bench, disassembling his rifle for cleaning with one hand while holding the wretched of the earth in the other. When asked why he read philosophy in the middle of a war zone, he once replied, "Because if I don't understand the mind of my enemy, I'll never free the soul of my people." He underlined one quote so many times the ink bled through the page: "To speak means to exist." Now, years later, that line returned to him with startling clarity. The screen in the war room had gone dark after the Geneva broadcast, but the echo of Bezos's words remained. Traoré sat still for a moment before asking one of his aides to replay the clip. The aide hesitated, uneasy with the tension in the room. "Sir, he's not worth it," the aide finally muttered, trying to break the weight in the air with diplomacy. But Traoré didn't flinch. He kept his eyes fixed on the screen as the clip looped again. Bezos's smirk, the laugh line about Wi-Fi, the smug silence that followed. Then, in a voice colder than before, he asked, "Then why do I feel like I owe my people a response?" It wasn't about pride. It wasn't even about Bezos. It was about something older, something deeper. A long history of being spoken about, but never spoken to. And Traoré had no intention of letting that moment pass without an answer. What happened next surprised everyone, including his own staff. 3 days after the broadcast, a formal communication arrived from the United Nations Economic Development Division. Traoré had been extended an invitation to address the upcoming UN Economic Forum in Geneva, the very summit where Bezos had spoken. The timing was more than coincidence. Though the message was wrapped in diplomatic language, the subtext was clear. The world was watching, and someone, somewhere, believed this African president might have something to say that was worth hearing. The event would be held in just under 2 weeks. It would host over 300 high-level delegates from every corner of the world: ministers of finance, tech CEOs, heads of state, and yes, Jeff Bezos himself, who would be present for a private roundtable discussion on tech expansion in the global south. For a brief moment, the war room in Ouagadougou buzzed with nervous speculation. Should Traoré accept? Was it a trap? A setup? A PR stunt to soften the blow? But the president remained calm. He closed the laptop, stood up slowly, and looked around the room at the faces of his staff. Young, tired, proud. Then he said, "We're going." One aide asked if he planned to deliver a prepared speech. Another suggested bringing in a Western-trained advisor to polish the talking points. Traoré shook his head. "This isn't a speech," he said. "It's a reckoning." And just like that, the laughter from Geneva stopped being funny. It had lit a fire, and that fire was heading back to where it started. But this time, it wasn't coming with silence. It was coming with a soldier who had learned not only to read the battlefield, but to read the room. The tension in the presidential quarters that evening felt like it could bend metal. The flight to Geneva was scheduled for dawn, and the final preparations were in full swing. Except no one could agree on one of the smallest, yet most symbolic details. What should President Traoré wear? The debate had started lightheartedly. One advisor argued for a tailored Western suit, preferably navy blue with a muted tie, something that would signal diplomacy and stability. Another insisted on traditional West African attire to assert cultural pride and independence. A third, perhaps bolder voice, proposed his military fatigues, the same olive uniform he had worn the day he led the uprising that ended foreign manipulation in Burkina Faso. Traoré, half amused by the discussion, finally broke the rising anxiety with a dry smile and a line that cut through the room like a blade. Maybe I'll wear both. A suit for the West and boots for the truth. Everyone laughed, but the laughter was brittle. They knew what was coming wasn't about clothes. It was about perception, power, and presence. In a room where words had failed for decades, every detail now mattered. As the team tried to finalize talking points, press releases, and logistics, Traoré quietly slipped away into his study. The notes they had drafted for him sat untouched on the desk. Lines about digital partnerships, economic inclusion, and regional alliances filled the pages. He skimmed them, then pushed them aside. In his mind, the speech had already begun writing itself days ago. Not in policy terms, but in principles. There was no need to memorize numbers or rehearse applause lines. If it's not lived, it doesn't need to be said, he whispered to himself. He stared at the map of Africa on the wall, his fingers tracing the line from Ouagadougou to Geneva. He wasn't just going to a forum, he was stepping into a room that had rarely welcomed African voices without condescension. This time, he would not arrive as a petitioner, but as a mirror, to reflect back everything the world refused to see. Across the ocean in Geneva, the mood could not have been more different. At the Grand Le Mans Hotel, on the 23rd floor, members of Bezos' entourage were enjoying drinks, laughter, and the kind of smug certainty that only unimaginable wealth can buy. They had just finished reviewing the guest list for the UN Economic Forum. One of them joked, "The president of what? Burger Faso?" Another smirked as he tossed a mint into his mouth and said, "This is going to be good TV." No one in the room saw the irony. No one paused to wonder what might happen if the man they were mocking actually showed up, not with complaints, but with conviction. They were too busy predicting the optics, the headlines, the potential viral sound bites they could spin. Meanwhile, back in Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was the opposite of luxurious. In modest homes lit by dim bulbs or candles, people gathered around radios, televisions, and shared smartphone screens. In villages where internet service came in short bursts and power outages were part of daily life, families made preparations as if it were a national holiday. Taxi drivers who had never missed a morning shift canceled fares for the next day. Grandmothers who couldn't pronounce Bezos still told their grandchildren, "Wake me when he speaks." Students pulled out national flags from storage, not for celebration, but for courage. The silence of those hours was deafening, not out of fear, but anticipation. A nation that had been laughed at was now wide awake, not because it needed to defend itself, but because for the first time in a long time, it felt like it might be heard. As the clock neared midnight, Traoré stood alone on the presidential balcony, looking out over the city. The streets were quiet, but he could feel the pulse of the people, the hope, the weight, the whispered prayers. He closed his eyes and exhaled. Tomorrow would not be just another summit. Tomorrow, in a room of polished suits and rehearsed smiles, a soldier would speak. Not as a victim, not as a guest, but as a voice carved from the soil of resistance. And whether the world listened or not, they would never forget what he said. The auditorium lights dimmed slightly as the MC announced the next speaker. There was polite applause, not enthusiastic, but procedural, as the name President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, echoed through the marble-paneled hall of the United Nations Economic Forum. A few heads turned out of curiosity, some out of courtesy, but more than a few smirked knowingly. Just 5 minutes earlier, the audience had watched a replay of Jeff Bezos' now-viral quip, the Wi-Fi and Kindle joke that had made its rounds across newsrooms and social media. The timing wasn't accidental. The organizers had conveniently programmed Traoré to speak immediately after Bezos' pre-recorded remarks. Some whispered it was to add balance. Others thought it was bait. Either way, the air was thick with quiet condescension. A diplomat from France leaned toward his American colleague and muttered, "Let's see if he can speak without a translator." Laughter tickled the edges of the room. But when Traoré stepped onto the stage, something shifted. Something subtle, but deeply unsettling. He wasn't smiling, yet he wasn't angry. He didn't carry notes. No teleprompter scrolled in front of him. He wore a charcoal gray suit, simple, elegant, but beneath it, his boots peeked through, polished from dust but unmistakably military. He took a slow breath and placed both hands on the podium. No theatrics, no gestures, just presence. The room stilled, not out of respect, but out of confusion. This was not how they expected him to arrive. Then with a steady voice he began. "I want to tell you a story," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Not to read them, but to let them read him. There was a boy once. He lived in a town with no bookstore, no library, and no electricity most nights. But he loved stories. He would gather coins, 10 francs here, 20 francs there, until he saved enough to buy his first book online. It was a book about space, about possibility. He clicked Buy Now on a website named after a river he had never seen. But the book never came. The website didn't ship to his country. Not then, not now." A few chuckles echoed from the back, confused whether it was meant to be funny. Traoré didn't pause. "That boy was me." You could feel the shift, the quiet lean forward, the silence growing dense like fog. "You speak of us," he continued, "as places of delay, of disorder, of disconnection. But we are not your broken code. We are not your failing signal. We are voices, ancient, proud, interrupted, but never erased." His voice began to rise, not in volume, but in gravity. This continent does not need charity wrapped in insult. It needs respect carved in truth. And truth cannot be delivered overnight in a cardboard box. Truth must be earned, with listening, with partnership, with dignity. A hush rolled through the hall. A delegate from Ghana put down her tablet. A reporter from Belgium stopped typing mid-sentence. Traoré's face remained calm, but his words landed like thunder. "When a man builds warehouses in the clouds," he said, "and forgets those who live under open skies, he does not lead. He floats." The line hung in the air like smoke, slow to fade, impossible to ignore. It wasn't a mic drop. It was a mirror. A sentence so stark, so poetic, it reflected every unspoken truth in the room. For a few seconds, no one moved. No coughs, no side chatter. Just the chilling realization that a man they expected to stumble had just redefined the conversation. And for the first time that day, no one laughed. For a moment that felt suspended outside of time, no one in the Grand UN Hall dared to breathe. After Traoré delivered his final line, "He does not lead, he floats," the world seemed to freeze in mid-motion. There was no applause, no shuffle of papers, just silence. A silence so sharp it felt like a scream swallowed by history. 10 full seconds passed. Not one person reached for their phone. Not one diplomat whispered to another. It was the kind of pause that didn't ask for attention. It commanded it. And then, almost as if on cue from something deeper than protocol, a woman from the South African delegation slowly rose to her feet. She didn't clap. She just stood. A heartbeat later, the delegate beside her stood too. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, more than 300 people, heads of state, trade ministers, climate advocates, corporate executives, were on their feet in silent recognition. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was something rarer. It was reverence. The cameras, sensing something extraordinary, cut to multiple angles. The still face of the Chinese ambassador, eyes wide with disbelief. The American trade representative frozen, lips slightly parted, and then, unexpectedly, a live feed to a private VIP lounge where Jeff Bezos was watching the proceedings via satellite stream. He had been relaxed moments earlier, reclined slightly with a glass of mineral water in hand. But now his expression had changed. The camera caught him mid-motion as he removed his earpiece slowly, methodically. His gaze didn't rise to meet the screen. He looked down, studying the floor as though it held answers. His fingers tapped the table twice, a nervous habit perhaps, before he whispered something to his aide and left the frame. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. The silence from the world's richest man had suddenly become louder than any insult he had ever made. Outside the confines of the auditorium, the ripple turned tidal. Within minutes, the hashtag #Africa Stands began trending across every major platform. Journalists scrambled to rewrite their headlines. Opinion columns were yanked and re-edited. In Kenya, Ghana, and Senegal, news anchors repeated Traoré's line about warehouses in the clouds as if it were scripture. Even in Seattle, inside Amazon's massive headquarters, a few anonymous employees, African and non-African alike, took to Twitter with surprising candor. One tweet read, "That wasn't a speech. That was a lesson in dignity. We should listen." Another simply said, "I work for the cloud, but I heard the sky today." The platform's trending bar glowed with tags like Ram, Burkina Faso Voice, Shash, Respect Africa, and Traoré Truth. And for the first time in years, Africa wasn't being spoken about as a crisis. It was being spoken of as a conscience. Back home in Ouagadougou, the atmosphere transformed as the footage played on loop across televisions, community projectors, and phone screens. It was nearly dusk, and the sun was casting a golden hue across the streets. People emerged from homes and shops, gathering in clusters, arms folded across chests, tears in eyes, some holding radios as if they were holy relics. Then the music began. Drums first, then horns, then voices, not in protest, but in pride. Teenagers danced barefoot in alleyways. Elderly men hugged each other outside cafes. Market women who'd seen too many broken promises stood tall, grinning with the quiet confidence of knowing that just once, the world had been forced to hear them. Not pity them, not fix them, just hear them. And in that moment, under the deepening sky, Burkina Faso wasn't small, it wasn't poor, it wasn't forgotten, it was seen, and more importantly, it was remembered. 3 days passed after the speech, and while the headlines had begun to settle, the silence from one corner of the world was deafening. Jeff Bezos had not released a statement, had not tweeted, had not made a single public comment since the Geneva Forum. His press team had canceled a planned interview with Bloomberg, citing schedule conflicts. But behind closed doors, conversations were happening, cautiously, urgently. Bezos was no stranger to public backlash, but this one felt different. This wasn't just another corporate controversy or a political dust-up. This was about dignity, and the perception that he had violated it, then been humbled by someone the global elite didn't expect to be formidable. The optics were devastating. A billionaire made a joke, and a president with no script, no teleprompter, and no global PR firm had answered with a sentence that shook the planet. The brand damage was spreading, and so a request was made, quiet, direct, and confidential. The message was delivered through diplomatic back channels, not through Amazon's public affairs office. It was worded carefully, stripped of ego, but lined with desperation. Jeff Bezos respectfully requested a private meeting with President Ibrahim Traoré. Off the record, no cameras, no press. The location was flexible, Geneva, New York, or even Ouagadougou if needed. The tone was deferential, almost rehearsed. There is value in dialogue. I believe a personal conversation could be mutually beneficial. There was no apology, but there was an undertone of surrender. Bezos, for all his power, now understood that there were things money could not clean, and one of them was a global loss of moral ground. When the message reached Traoré's desk, he read it once, folded the page, and set it aside. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he walked to the balcony of the presidential office and looked out at the city. The evening call to prayer echoed faintly in the distance, mingling with the honks of taxis and the laughter of school children playing football in the alley below. He stood in that stillness for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around him. Then he returned to his desk, opened a blank sheet of paper, and wrote his response by hand. It was short, less than 3 sentences, but it said everything that needed to be said. Burkina Faso is open to all, but we are no longer open for sale. There was no signature flourish, no official seal, just a name at the bottom and a truth that rang louder than any speech. The letter was delivered through the same private channels, But it didn't stay private for long. Within hours, someone, no one knows exactly who, leaked a photo of the handwritten note. It went viral in minutes. Social media lit up with praise. News outlets across Africa hailed it as the firmest polite no in diplomatic history. Meanwhile, in Western media, a scramble began. CNN released a segment calling the Geneva Exchange a cultural misunderstanding. A Washington Post editorial reframed the moment as a missed opportunity for economic alignment. Business Insider ran a piece titled, "Did Bezos actually mean it that way?" But it was too late. The public had already made up its mind. In this story, there were no misunderstandings, only a moment where power met principle, and power blinked first. The story might have faded, as news cycles often do, replaced by the next scandal or summit. But something about that speech, and the silence that followed it, lingered longer than expected. It echoed not just in conference halls, but in places where the internet flickered in and out, where screens were shared among neighbors, and where hope usually arrived late or not at all. One of those places was a small town in western Burkina Faso, Bobo Dioulasso, where 12-year-old Fatimata Kabore lived with her family. Their home didn't always have power, and when it did, it was rationed between a light bulb, a fan, and a tiny secondhand television. But the night President Traoré spoke, they turned off the fan, lit a candle, and tuned in as a family. Fatimata didn't understand all the economics or politics, but she understood the feeling in her father's eyes. That stillness, that pride, that rare and quiet certainty that something important had just happened. 2 days later, with a pink pen and a lined notebook, Fatimata wrote a letter in her best cursive. It began simply, "Dear President Traoré, thank you. Now my dad says I can be president too." She wrote about watching the speech, about how she saw people crying on the street, about how her older brother said, "For once, we weren't small." She ended the letter with a drawing, a little girl wearing a sash and boots, standing behind a podium, smiling. Her mother helped her fold the paper neatly, tuck it in an envelope, and walk it to the local post office. They didn't expect it to be delivered. They certainly didn't expect it to be read. But 3 days later, it landed on the president's desk in Ouagadougou, unopened mail among dozens of official memos and formal endorsements. One of his aides noticed the childlike handwriting and handed it to him with a smile. Traoré read it in silence. Then he read it again, and the second time, he smiled back. In a modest classroom the next week, Fatimata was asked to read her letter aloud. The teacher had heard about the president's response and wanted to turn the moment into a lesson. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, hands folded neatly in their laps, while Fatimata stood at the front of the room. She read slowly, nervously at first, until she got to the line. "Now my dad says I can be president too." The class giggled. The teacher nodded and said, "This, children, is history." Then she added, "But more importantly, this is proof that your voice matters. No matter how small you are, no matter how far." Fatimata sat down to a soft round of claps, cheeks red, but her smile brighter than ever. Her words, innocent yet profound, had touched something the world's richest man had overlooked, the importance of being seen. Back in the capital, Traoré kept the letter folded neatly in his jacket pocket. At cabinet meetings, during interviews, even while walking through the market, it was always with him. One afternoon, as he prepared for a new round of policy discussions with international advisors, one of his aides asked why he hadn't moved on, why he still carried that little girl's letter. Traoré didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, watching the people bustle through the city below. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "I wanted to fix the signal. I didn't know we'd wake the world." His aide said nothing more. There was nothing else to say. Because sometimes the loudest change begins with the quietest voice, and sometimes the most powerful messages aren't coded in tech or carried by satellites. They're handwritten, sealed with hope, and sent across the country by a girl who just wanted her father to believe she could lead. In a world obsessed with volume, with headlines that scream, with leaders who shout, with billionaires who broadcast, this story reminded us of something older, quieter, and far more powerful. That real power doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come dressed in noise or wrapped in spectacle. Sometimes it just stands, steady, rooted, unshaken, and waits for the room to catch up. Ibrahim Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't retaliate with insults or play to the cameras. Instead, he stood in the eye of a storm, looked directly at the world's most powerful man, and said what needed to be said, not with fury, but with precision. And in doing so, he shifted the weight of the conversation, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every place and every people who had ever been spoken down to, laughed at, or erased. Respect isn't given by default, not by title, not by wealth, and certainly not by algorithms. It's proven by presence, by truth, by the refusal to remain silent when silence is what's expected. Traoré had no media team sculpting viral moments. He had no security in that moment, no guarantee of applause. He had only his voice and the courage to use it, not for ego, but for everyone watching from the margins, waiting for someone to remind the room that worth cannot be measured by GDP or bandwidth or brand visibility. That moment, quiet, powerful, unshakable, taught us that dignity is not negotiated, it is declared. And so he didn't reclaim the mic. He reminded the world he never gave it up. This story is a work of fiction. The characters Ibrahim Traoré and Jeff Bezos, as portrayed in this narrative, are entirely fictional and do not represent the real individuals in any way. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The events and dialogue depicted have been dramatized for storytelling purposes and are not intended to reflect real-world facts or opinions. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so I can continue creating powerful and meaningful stories that inspire, entertain, and make you think. Your support means everything.